All right, so the existence of God, lecture 3, and we'll start at section 1, just asking the basic question, does God exist? And I thought we would start off with a fun Bible verse, Psalm 14:1. The fool says in his heart, there's no God. Now, if you're looking for a good way to begin an apologetics discussion with somebody, this verse will at least be a conversation starter. It might actually get on people's nerves, being called a fool right out the gate. But the reason why this verse is important, I think, is because whether you believe in God or you don't believe in God, we can all agree in the principle here in that sort of cosmic foolishness is wrapped up in whether or not you believe in God or not. If God is real and we don't believe in him, well, there could be nothing more foolish than to deny the center of all reality itself. If God is not real and we are spending our entire life pursuing him and living for him, well, then we're wasting our life on a fairy tale. So the height of foolishness is at stake in whether or not God is real and whether or not we believe in him. When it comes to defending the Christian faith, which is what apologetics is all about, when it comes to defending the rationality of the Christian faith, the existence of God is a critical step, because all other discussions about the faith, whether it be the Bible as the Word of God, Jesus as God's Son, we as sinners who have broken God's law, God saving us from our sins, all of those are moot if God does not exist. If God is not real, then none of the rest is actually true. The Christian message is not true. If the foundation of God is gone, there is no building of faith. So in this lecture, we're going to try to demonstrate that it is reasonable to believe in the existence of God. Now, what I want you to understand before we dig in is that we are not yet arguing for the specific God of Christianity. We will be doing that in the following lectures. Tonight, we will be establishing a theistic God in general. That makes sense? We'll establish that, then we'll move on to demonstrate that the God who exists is, in fact, the God of Christianity. So let's go on to we're going to look at some different arguments tonight for the existence of God. And the first is the religious argument. We kind of touched on this last week, and we'll briefly revisit it. Wherever mankind has existed, there's always been religion. There has always been some recognition of or some reverence for the transcendent, that which is beyond us, that which is worthy of our worship. And we have to ask, why is this the case? Why is it that humanity is instinctively religious? Now, if these religious sort of natural inclinations could be limited to a little small group of humanity, right? There was a group that lived on an island somewhere and they never had contact with the real world. Well, then we could maybe write off religion as sort of a delusion or wishful thinking. But the fact of the matter is that this God instinct has been present in every group of humans that have ever lived in every age and every corner of the world. You could take a people group on this side of the globe and a people group on this side of the globe who have never had any sort of contact with each other, and you find out that they both have this intrinsic faith in something higher than themselves. The question we have to ask is, why is that? And the existence of an actual deity actually has a lot of explaining power. If there is really such a thing as God, then it makes total sense why God's humans that he created all have this sort of built-in instinctive sense of him. There's a Christian philosopher by the name of Alvin Plantinga who in recent years, he's made some very convincing arguments that faith in God is what's called a basic belief. A basic belief is a universal intuition that is both unprovable and yet indisputable. It's not something that you can lay out evidence to necessarily demonstrate that it's for sure true, but it's also indisputable. We accept the fact that it is real. It comes to us almost naturally. It's a self-evident belief that humanity shares. And Plantinga points out there's actually several different areas of knowledge that are basic beliefs, things that we know are intuitively true. And he shows that the idea of God is actually very similar to these. So he argues that believing in God's existence by sort of this built-in human intuition is actually pretty rational. Now, in the Darwinian worldview, this concept of faith in a higher power, it has to be explained in terms of evolution. That's sort of the Darwinian way of explaining everything, is through evolutionary concepts. So here's the basic way it goes. As mankind evolved, so we come from primates, who in turn had evolved from other creatures. As these primates evolved into Homo sapiens, we began doing something that no other creature does. We began to think about more than just food, shelter, and reproduction. Those are some of the big concerns of animals, right? Just surviving. Where am I going to eat? Where am I going to drink? How am I going to mate? How am I going to, stay safe? Those are the basic concerns of animals. But as humans developed and as our human mind developed beyond that of beasts, we began thinking about things that no other animal had previously considered, such as, why am I here? What is my purpose? And what happens after I die? I can't read dogs' minds, but I have a strong feeling that when the dog is looking out the glass window at the squirrel and his tail is going like this, he's not thinking about transcendent questions such as, what is the purpose in my life? All he's thinking is squirrel, right? Animals don't have these ponderances about the meaning of life, but people do. And so according to the Darwinian view, as mankind began asking these questions, there were unfortunately no answers to be found because those answers actually don't exist. And so what happened is, for these people asking these questions, life became very emotionally and psychologically unbearable. Mankind was weighed down by this thought of, do I actually have a purpose here, or is it all for nothing? When I die, what's going to happen to me then? I don't want my existence to come to an end. And it was difficult for this evolved human creature to go on with these big questions hanging over their heads unresolved. So the idea is that religion was invented to help sort of soothe these questions. And so religion was a crutch that served an evolutionary purpose. Mankind needed some reason to keep living. Survival of the fittest. He needed something to keep him going. So religion was a false crutch that he used to continue on in his desire to keep existing and surviving. But I think there's a very big problem with this. Because, again, according to an evolutionist, man's advanced mind is presumably a very good thing. In Darwinian theory, that's one of the things that sets us apart from animals, is our evolved, enhanced mind. In fact, if we didn't have these advanced minds, then the scientist and the philosopher couldn't be making these arguments in the first place. As a species higher on the rung of evolution, our heightened consciousness and deeper thinking, these are supposedly tremendous benefits. But are they, if you look at it from a purely Darwinian worldview? Because in this worldview, our advanced evolution produced in us these unnecessary questions that no other animal had ever asked, to which there are no answers, to which leads us to existential fear, dread, and discontentment. So think about that for a moment. If there really was no answer to these questions, and the lack of answer to those questions produced in us this existential dread and worry over death, then our advanced mind was actually a detriment to our survival. And it was a detriment to our mental health. It was a detriment to our emotional health. It was a detriment to the way we think about the world. No other creature needs religious instincts to survive. A dog, a squirrel, a deer, they can do just fine without needing to stop to think about religion. But us, the questions trouble us greatly. They keep us up at night. They cause us to wring our hands with despair and anxiousness. It would actually be a tremendous detriment to us if our evolved mind, if anything, our evolved mind should cause us to think about these things less, so as not to hinder us in our journey for survival of the fittest. In fact, it's a lack of these religious instincts that allows animals to focus exclusively on their survival, untroubled by the meaninglessness of it all. That actually fits them for a material universe better. Ultimate questions about meaning, morality, mortality, can't those just be like pesky flies in it? You're just trying to enjoy the here and now. You just want to live the good life. You just want to enjoy a meal. You just want to reproduce. You just want to find a place to sleep at night. That's all you care about. You're a very simple person. But these nagging questions about ultimate meaning and higher reality keep troubling you. In a Darwinian worldview, that would actually, our advanced minds would actually be a detriment to us, not a benefit. So the atheist worldview is in the awkward spot of having to claim that man's greatest evolved trait, his mind, is actually one of his greatest enemies, because it raises these unanswerable questions that distract us from mere material survival. Okay, that was just kind of an introduction to the religious argument. I apologize if I take swigs. I actually had a really bad cold over this past weekend. And I think one of the ways that God reminds me of my continual dependence on him is I talk a lot from my work. And whenever I get a cold, my voice always goes. Always. And I forgot to bring my cough drops. So between water and tea, I'm hoping to keep my throat pretty well liquefied. No, liquefied is not the right word. That would be even worse. Oh, you've got cough drops with you. You are a godsend, sir. May I? Oh, okay. Oh, thank you. Whew. That's good. It's that first taste that's really hard to bear anyway. I didn't realize it had 2 layers of plastic. I almost got a layer of plastic there. All right. Let's go on to a couple other arguments. The first one we're going to consider is what's called the cosmological argument. This comes from the Greek word cosmos. Cosmos refers to the universe and everything within it. And so the cosmological argument uses the existence of the universe to point backwards to the necessity of God for the existence of the universe. So you can turn to page 3, and we'll talk about argument from existence. A couple months ago, I was putting my kids to bed, and my 7-year-old son asked the question that I had been dreading. But it's the question that every child asks at some point. Where do babies come from? And it's something every child inevitably asks. Now, why do kids ask that all on their own? Nobody has to plant that idea in them. They come up with that question all by themselves. Why is that? Because one of the facts of reality that's even observable to a small child is that everything comes from somewhere. Nothing just pops out of nowhere. Everything has a source. Everything comes from somewhere. So the child knows there's no baby, suddenly there's a kid in our house. Where did the baby, did the stork really bring this baby? Did we go and pluck her up in the garden? She had to have come from somewhere. A baby doesn't just magically spring into being. If you were to walk into work, for example, let's say you come into the office and there sitting on your desk is a box of chocolates. And they're anonymous. There's no note, there's no tag, no anything like that. They're just there. And you know, I didn't buy these chocolates. The first question you wonder is, who gave them to me? Where did they come from? You would never assume a box of chocolates just sort of sprang up out of the desk. Because, and then your first endeavor of the day would be, I got to find out who gave me these chocolates. Either, you know, I've got a secret admirer and I'm flattered, or I need to tell my husband to beat somebody up, something like that. The cosmological argument takes those same principles that everything has to come from somewhere. Everything has a cause, and it applies it back to God. Since the universe exists, the cosmological argument says that a transcendent, intelligent being is the most likely cause behind it. Now, the Bible itself uses a form of the cosmological argument in several passages. Probably the 2 most well-known are Psalm 19 and Romans 1. Psalm 19 says, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, there are no words, whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes out through all the earth, and their words to the end of the world." Psalm 19 imagines the heavens kind of anthropomorphically proclaiming the one who made them, just by the fact that the heavens exist. They don't use the sound of a voice. They don't have actual words they're speaking, but their existence itself is like a megaphone directing our attention to the one who made them. Romans 1, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made." So they were without excuse. So Romans 1 says God is invisible in the sense that we can't see him with our physical eye, but the reality of God is made visible through the things that he has created. The created order testifies to its creator. And in fact, this testimony is so clear that he says people are without excuse for believing that there is a God. That's how clear the testimony is. Now, excuse me, I want to look at a particular variation of the cosmological argument called the Kalam argument. The Kalam argument has been made very popular in recent years by a Christian apologist by the name of William Lane Craig. William Lane Craig, just to be candid with you guys, I don't agree with him on a lot of his theology and some of his philosophy, but as an apologist arguing for the existence of God, there is almost no one better in the game. So William Lane Craig offers what's called the Kalam argument. And before we can dig into this argument, we have to understand the structure of it, because the Kalam argument depends on what's called deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning typically has 2 premises and then a conclusion. You start with premise A, you go to premise B. And then if both premise A and premise B are definitely true, then your conclusion reveals something about the relationship between the two. And it's an airtight argument. It's airtight because if the premises are true, then the conclusion will always be correct. So here's the most famous example. And this was used often by the Greek philosophers. So a very common example is premise A is all men are mortal. Premise B, Socrates is a man. Therefore, C, that's your conclusion. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. You see how that works? Premise A says all men are mortal. Is that true? Yes. Premise B, Socrates is a man. Is that true? Yes. So what's the conclusion? Well, then Socrates is mortal. You can draw a conclusion that way. The conclusion is guaranteed to be true if both the premises are true. So the Kalam argument follows this deductive reasoning. And here's the way it goes. Premise A, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise B, the universe began to exist. So C, your conclusion is, therefore, the universe had a cause. I'll say that one more time. The first premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise B, the universe began to exist. So C, our conclusion is, therefore, the universe had a cause. Let's go through these three steps. We'll look at the first two, and we'll make sure that the premises are true, and that will lead us to an airtight conclusion. So, excuse me, premise A, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Well, we know this is true at least two different ways. We know it's true rationally, and we know it's true experientially. So experientially, we have never encountered anything that began to exist that was not caused by something else. Think about something that has not always existed. There was a time when it did not exist, and then it did exist. It was always caused. Your car, for example, you know that somebody built it. The trees in your the trees in the woods in your backyard, they had to come from somewhere. Even you have not always existed. You had to have been caused by something. So experientially, we have never met something that, that at one point began to exist that was not caused. Everything that begins to exist is caused by something. And we know this logically as well, because it's impossible for something to generate itself. If something does not exist, it can't bring itself into existence. In order to come into existence, something else must have caused it. Do you guys see why that's irrational to say that something cannot bring itself into existence? Why it's irrational to say otherwise? Because if something doesn't exist, it doesn't have the existing qualities it needs to then bring itself into existence. And if it already exists, there's no need for it to bring itself into existence because it already exists. So I think premise A holds up pretty good. Everything that begins to exist needs a cause. Something has to cause it. B, the universe began to exist. Now, it was once very popular, especially in atheistic circles, to believe that the universe was eternal, to believe that it's always been. And if that were the case, the God problem might go away. Because if the universe has always been there, you don't need to give an account of who created it or where it came from. The origins of the universe wouldn't need to even be thought about because it's just always been. Carl Sagan was an astronomer. He did not believe in God, and he put it like this: if the universe was always here, if the universe was infinitely old, then there's nothing for a creator to do. But modern science has given very good demonstration that there was a point when the universe did not exist. And then something happened that caused it to come into existence. And there's at least two ways that modern science has demonstrated this. First, the universe is expanding. This was really confirmed in the year 1929 by a gentleman you've probably heard of before, Edwin Hubble, who the Hubble telescope is named after. He had an unprecedented telescope that allowed people to see further out into the expanse of the universe than we ever had been before. And as he made these observations, he noticed that the universe was expanding. However, it could not have been expanding like that for eternity, because in order to be expanding out, it had to have started from a particular point. Something can't be infinitely expanding out. It has to start from a particular point from which it expands. Another reason is because the universe is winding down. This is what's known as the second law of thermodynamics, that the universe is winding down. But the universe could not have been eternally winding down, or else it would have wound down by now. So for these two reasons, and there's several others, but those are the two prominent ones, we can say with a lot of surety, the universe is not eternal. There was a time when it did not exist, which you couldn't really call it time, but it didn't exist, and then something happened that brought it into existence. Modern scientists have called this the Big Bang. There was nothing, and then there was this big bang, this definitive moment, and all things came into existence. As Christians, we would say there was a Big Bang, there was just somebody behind it. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? There was nothing, and then something caused it. Therefore, we come to our conclusion, therefore, the universe had a cause. With these two premises established, we can affirm the airtight conclusion. The universe had a cause. If everything that begins to exist requires a cause, and the universe began to exist, therefore, the universe required a cause. Here's another way we can think about it. 4 possible ways to explain the origin of the universe. Option number 1, the universe is just a big illusion. None of it is actually real at all. Number 2, the universe is self-created. It made itself. It generated itself into being. Option number 3, the universe is eternal. Or option number 4, the universe was caused by something else outside of itself. I think all 3 of your first possibilities have huge problems. Option 1 doesn't solve the problem because even if, let's say, the universe were one big illusion, there must be someone or something having the illusion. Nothingness can't have an illusion. So even if the universe as we now perceive it is just an illusion, there's someone or something having the illusion. Well, who are they? Where did they come from? How did they come into existence? That doesn't solve the problem. It just kicks it down the line a little bit. Option number 2, as we've discussed, is illogical. Something can't create itself because it didn't exist in order to create itself in the first place. And option number 3, as we've discussed, doesn't match the scientific data that the universe has just always been. That leaves option 4 as the most reasonable explanation. The universe was caused by something outside of itself. But then that raises the question, what? What is this cause that caused the universe? Well, in order to consider that, there's something we need to remember about the universe. It's made up of time, space, and matter. Those are kind of the 3 things that encompass all the universe. Everything within the universe can be said to be time, space, or matter. And all 3 are critical. Time is the dimension through which events happen. Space is the 3-dimensional place where events happen. And matter is the stuff that fills space and experiences the passage of time. All right, so 3 things about the universe. It's made up of time, space, and matter. Now remember, if something caused the universe, it had to be something outside the universe because the universe can't make itself. So whatever caused the universe is outside the universe. Therefore, whatever it was that caused the universe is outside of time, space, and matter. That means whatever made the universe is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Timeless means without beginning or end, not bound to a passage of moments. Spaceless means not limited to one location. And immaterial means not made up of physical stuff, physical matter. Okay, everybody see that? If there's ever any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. Don't be afraid to ask. The universe is made of time, space, and matter. The universe couldn't create itself. The universe has not always been there. Something else caused it. But since time, space, and matter came into existence with the universe, that's what it's made out of, whatever it was that caused it has to be timeless, outside of time, spaceless, outside of space, and immaterial, outside of matter. Now, isn't it interesting that all 3 of these things are ways that the Bible describes God? Now, notice so far, we have not used the Bible to make our argument. I'm not saying we shouldn't use the Bible. I'm just saying at this point, we've come to this conclusion simply by observing the way the universe works and trying to use logic. Okay? So we can, without even making a religious argument, we can just use logic to say the universe was caused by something that is timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Now, were such a cause to exist, if there were a timeless, spaceless, immaterial cause of the universe, it would be accurate to describe this thing, whatever it is, as supernatural. Now, some may object to that word. When you hear supernatural, you think of like Halloween decorations or ghosts or spooks or something like that. But super is simply a prefix we attach to the beginning of a word to show that whatever the thing is, it goes above and beyond whatever that thing normally is. So think about, if you take the word man, we all know what a man is. Well, nowadays, not so much. But in general, we all know what a man is. If you attach super to that, it means that this man goes above and beyond an ordinary man, right? Or think about a supermarket. A market is a place where like you buy groceries. A supermarket goes above and beyond a normal place where you buy groceries, and it's like the next step up. So to talk about the supernatural simply means it's above and beyond the realm of nature. And remember, nature is comprised of time, space, and matter. Whatever caused the universe is above and beyond time, space, and matter. It is above and beyond nature. Therefore, it is supernatural. These are not just hokey religious words. These are logical conclusions about observing the universe. The word supernatural isn't just blind faith in fairies and leprechauns. It's actually a logically warranted necessity for the universe of time, space, and matter to even exist. Now, before we move on, I think there's a couple other traits about this cause behind the universe we could probably infer. First, I would argue that this cause would need to be powerful. Why is that? Because great ability would be needed to bring forth the universe. The universe is pretty big, in case you hadn't noticed. Intelligent. It would take intelligence to plan and organize the vast complexities of the universe. And thirdly, it would have to be personal. Why is that? Because intelligence can only belong to a personal being with a mind. Intelligence cannot belong to a non-personal entity. Once again, these traits all align with how the Bible describes God. Now, I think there is an atheistic inability to provide an answer to this question. Where did the universe come from? Because when asked about an atheist might give you a really long, laid out explanation of Darwinian evolution, of the Big Bang, that sort of thing. But if you ask, how could something come from nothing? What was it that caused the universe to come into existence? An atheist will only be able to explain to you what happened like a millionth of a second after the Big Bang. They have no ability to explain what caused it. And so many atheists will honestly admit, we don't know. There's many suggestions. Some have suggested that the basic ingredients needed to create the universe were already just sort of floating around, and then something caused it to explode. Several problems with that is that there's no reasonable explanation about why this would explode. No way to assume that. Also, remember, time, space, and matter are not eternal, so they couldn't have just been eternally floating around out there. Some have speculated that a multiverse could exist. That means that there's an infinite number of universes out there, and of all those infinite numbers of universes, ours just so happens to be the one to have all the right conditions for life to exist. Some propose that the universe is in this eternal cycle of expansion and contraction. So basically, you see the universe, and then it contracts and it sort of dies, and then it's rebirthed again, and it expands again with all these new cycles. There was actually a theory in the year 2021 put out by a professor of science at Harvard University. And he wrote an article in a very reputable scientific magazine called The Scientific American. He suggested that our universe was created in an alien laboratory. This is not sci-fi. This is a very real suggestion that has been proposed. Now, I find it interesting that there's no problem with believing that we were created by some higher being, so long as that higher being is an alien and not God. Now, what should be noticeable about all these suggestions is every single one of them is grounded in absolute speculation. Zero evidence for any of these whatsoever. Something must have caused the universe. But if it's not God, then theories go wild. Any serious attempt to argue any of these options, there is an infinite number of universes. We were cooked up in an alien laboratory. All of these proposals rely on faith alone. There is no evidence suggesting any of these things. And so at the end of the day, even the most ardent atheist has to admit two things. The universe could not have spontaneously popped into being all by itself, but two, we have no idea how it happened. The last thing I want to point out in this section is I found it really interesting that there have been attempts by some of the world's smartest scientists to recreate the Big Bang. And they think if we can just assemble all the right, maybe some of those primordial ingredients that were there, that were just kind of floating, and if we can put them all together in the right sort of context, maybe we can do like a mini Big Bang. And then that'll explain the origins of the universe. If done successfully, this would supposedly answer that question. Where'd the universe come from? But there's three interesting things I think about these kinds of attempts. Firstly, the very name, recreate, doesn't that imply that it was created the first time around? Secondly, needing to assemble a large team of the world's most intelligent beings in order to design a universe would, if anything, prove just how critical intelligent design is actually to the existence of the universe, not the other way around. If you are trying to prove that the universe could begin without intelligent design, you should not assemble a team of really intelligent beings to try to prove that. If anything, you'll just prove how smart the person doing it would need to be. But then thirdly, there's still no way to account for how those original elements that led to the Big Bang were there in the first place. So the problem of God is not actually solved at all. It simply punts the problem further down the field. All right, that's the cosmological argument. Since our discussion went a little bit late, we'll go ahead and we'll take on this next section, and then we'll go ahead and we'll do our break. So any questions about the cosmological argument? Okay, let's go on to the teleological argument. Now, I mentioned last week, this is the argument that a lot of scientists actually really, really like. As we'll see, even atheistic scientists who don't believe in God will say, if there were an argument to convince me, this would be the one. The teleological argument comes from the Greek word teleos. Teleos refers to something's ultimate aim or purpose. And so the teleological argument uses the order and the regularity of the universe. It's like things seem to have been caused with a design. There seems to be some purpose for which things were made. They have intricate design that allows them to function, and that seems to point backward to a creator. Excuse me. This is also called the fine-tuning argument. Why is it called the fine-tuning argument? Well, I don't think kids today will ever be able to relate with some of the problems that we had when we were kids. One was trying to listen to radio programs, because back in the good old days of FM and AM, if your favorite radio program was coming on, you would have to get the dial tuned to just the exact right spot. Otherwise, you would just hear static. So the tuning had to be in the perfect spot in order for a clear signal to come through. Or think about with music. If you're a musician, you know the importance of tuning. If something is off even one little bit, it can throw off the entire song. A musician knows that in order to create good music, the instruments must be fine-tuned. And so in a similar way, the teleological argument is called the fine-tuning argument because it points out how precisely the universe needs to be tuned to the exact dial. You move that dial one little microcosm of an inch, and you've got no radio show. There are certain principles at work in the universe that if they were altered in even the slightest little degree, not only could there not be life on Earth, but on a bigger scale, the universe itself couldn't even exist. And so the teleological argument concludes that this precision could not have happened by accident any more than a group of animals banging around on rocks can create a symphony. Let's talk about the watchmaker analogy. This was made famous by a man named William Paley. He was an Anglican minister and a philosopher. He wrote a book called Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity. People just gave books so much better names back then, right? Like today, this would have been shortened to something to like, You Can Believe in God. And then their titles back then were way more epic. But here's Paley's basic argument. He says, suppose you were walking through a big field, nothing around for miles, and suddenly you come upon a watch. How did the watch get there? Now, there's two things if that were to happen. You're walking through a field, you find this watch. It's a beautiful piece of craftsmanship. It's ticking. It's gold. All the gears are working just right. There's two things you would not assume. You would not assume that the watch had just been sitting there forever, and you would not assume that it had come to be that way due to accidental forces of nature. That because of the wind and the rain and the tide and animals stomping and leaving their droppings and grass growing or whatever, and all these things just happen to come together in just the right way that this intricate watch would be the product. Because certain things can result from accidental forces, right? Such as, I give an example there, a pond full of rainwater or a broken branch on the ground. Those don't require intelligent design. They can come about by pretty simple events, sometimes even accidental ones. But a watch is different because a watch is incredibly complex. There's so many inner gears that have to be just the right size, fitted in just the right way, working in just the right relation to each other in order for the watch to work. The intricate pieces must be precise, they must be fitted just so, and they must all work together in a very particular way. No intelligent being would come upon that watch in the field and not assume that another intelligent being had created it. So in a similar way, the complexity of the universe necessary for reality and life should lead us to conclude that there's an intelligent being behind it all. Because after all, the mechanics, the clockwork, you might say, of the universe is far more complex than a watch. If a watch requires a designer, how much more something as intricate as the universe or the human body? Because the more complex an object is, the more necessary it is that intelligence be behind it. So here's an example. Suppose you come across a piece of paper and there is red and blue paint splotched down the front. You've got two options. It could have been a toddler's attempt at artwork, or it could have been somebody just accidentally kicked over 2 cans of paint and this splotching was the result. The painting is very, very simple, and its simplicity means it could very well have been caused by an accident. But let's say you come upon a portrait of a lady who has lifelike eyes. The picture has perfect shadowing. Her clothing is so textured, it almost looks like you could reach out and touch the fabric. And this photographic scenery in the background. You would never assume for a moment that jars had just accidentally been tipped. Because the more intricate and complex something is, the more it requires a designer. Now, Paley's whole argument depends on the complexity of the universe. If the universe is actually not that complex, then his argument doesn't hold up. But if we find that the conditions necessary for the universe and life itself are incredibly intricate, then an intelligent being seems like the most likely explanation. So there's 3 different things we'll look at in this second point, 3 different arguments. The first is that of anthropic constants. Oh, I'm sorry, I said 3. I actually meant 2. Anthropic constants. There are many highly specific settings that would need to be true of the universe in order for, 1, the universe to even exist, and 2, for Earth to be able to facilitate life. And the combination of these settings makes it appear as though the universe were specifically designed to host us. This is what's called an anthropic principle. And the settings required are called anthropic constants. An anthropic constant is basically a finely tuned setting that must be true and must always be true in order for the universe to exist and in order for life to exist. Now, there's various estimates on how many anthropic constants there are. Some have said as low as 15. Some have said as many as 122. Many of them cross over with each other. But I'm going to share with you guys a list from a book called I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist by apologists Norman Geisler and Frank Turek. They provide 15. Here's the list. 1 is that of oxygen level. Oxygen makes up 21% of the Earth's atmosphere. If it were 25%, just a little bit higher, there would be fires spontaneously erupting everywhere. But if it were 15%, just a little bit lower than that, we would all suffocate. There's something called atmospheric transparency. If the Earth's atmosphere were less transparent, we wouldn't receive enough radiation from the sun. So that means if it was less transparent, if it was thicker, not enough radiation from the sun could get through. We couldn't survive. But if it were more transparent, if more radiation from the sun could get through, it would be too much. Now, this atmosphere, by the way, that has this perfect level of transparency, it itself is composed of many precise levels of nitrogen, oxygen, carbon dioxide, and ozone. Thirdly, the Moon-Earth gravitational interaction. If the interaction between the moon and the Earth were either stronger or weaker, the tidal waves and atmosphere on Earth would be drastically different, and life would not be possible. Fourthly, the carbon dioxide level. If the carbon dioxide in our atmosphere were higher, we'd burn up. If it were lower, that says plants, that's a typo, it should say plants. The plants could not perform photosynthesis, and we would suffocate. Fifthly is gravity. If the gravitational force were changed by even 0.3701, our sun would not exist, and obviously neither would we. Then there's this fun thing called the centrifugal force of planetary movement. It means this. If the outward force of planets did not precisely match the gravitational forces, nothing could orbit the sun. 7, the universe expansion rate. We talked earlier about how the universe has been expanding since that definitive moment of creation. It's been expanding. If it had expanded at a 1/1,000,000th slower of a rate, it would not have continued expanding. It actually would have collapsed in on itself. But if it had expanded any faster, galaxies could not have formed. It would have been too quick. 8, the velocity of the speed of light. All laws of physics depend on the exact speed of light, which as of now is estimated to be about 186,000 miles per second. It's there in meters, but since we're all good Americans, I put it there in miles. If this speed of light were any different, life could not exist. 9th, water vapor levels in the atmosphere. If the water vapor levels in our atmosphere were any higher, there would be a greenhouse effect that would make our Earth's temperature too hot for human life. If it was lower, it would be too cold for human life. Then you've got Jupiter's orbit. You don't probably think about Jupiter when you think about life on Earth, but Jupiter's size and its orbit, the path of its orbit and its strength, its gravitational strength, makes it sort of a vacuum cleaner. There's many asteroids and comets that might otherwise hit Earth that Jupiter actually sucks in for us, keeps us safe. 11th, the thickness of the Earth's crust. Nearly half of the Earth's crust is made up of oxygen. Now, if that crust were thicker, there would be too much oxygen for life to be possible. But if the crust were thinner, then there would be a lot more volcanic activity, the tectonic plates would be shifting around a lot more, and life would not be possible. The 24-hour period of the Earth's rotation. If the Earth's rotation took longer than 24 hours, the temperature differences between night and day would be too drastic. This is what happens on other planets. This is why many of their climates are unlivable, because they have a different rotation time, and it makes the temperatures too drastic. If it were shorter, the velocity of wind in the atmosphere would be too great. This is also why some planets have really, really strong wind, hundreds of miles per hour. Either way, Earth would be unlivable. The 23-degree axial tilt of the Earth. If the axial tilt of the Earth were any different, the warming effects of the sun's energy would make temperatures too drastic. The atmospheric discharge rate. Lightning is a discharge of the atmosphere. If this rate were greater, there'd be too much destruction caused by fire, and if it were less, it would not provide enough nitrogen for the Earth's soil. Did you realize that the Earth's soil actually gets nitrogen from lightning? If it were less than it is, the Earth's soil could not get enough nitrogen and no plants would be able to grow. And then 15th would be the seismic activity levels. If there were more earthquakes than what we see, life on Earth would be unsustainable. If there were less, the valuable nutrients that sit at the bottom of the ocean floors and rivers would never be brought back up to the surface again. I was just reading a really interesting article this week talking about how earthquakes are absolutely devastating, but in some ways they can actually be good, because what they do is they take all those sort of minerals that sit at the bottom of the seas and the rivers, and it shakes up the Earth, and it kind of brings them back up to the surface again. That allows life to continue as normal. So these are just 15 of these anthropic constants that if any of these were different to any degree, the universe could not exist and life could not exist on Earth. And so Hugh Ross, he's a physicist. He's got a PhD in astronomy. And he took all 122 anthropic constants, and he said the probability of all of them happening for any single planet was 1 in quinquadragintillion. And that's 1 followed by 138 zeros. And for your reading pleasure, I included that number at the bottom of your page. That's what it looks like. If any of these were off by even a bit, life would not exist. And so there was a man named Arno Penzias. He was a physicist, astronomer. He won the Nobel Peace Prize back in the 70s. He said, astronomy leads us to a unique event, a universe which was created out of nothing and delicately balanced to provide exactly the conditions required to support life. In the absence of an absurdly improbable accident, the observations of modern science seem to suggest an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan. And even Stephen Hawking, he was a world-renowned physicist and cosmologist. He did not believe in God, but even he had to admit in his famous book, A Brief History of Time, he said, the laws of science as we know them at present contain many fundamental numbers, like the size of the electric charge and of the electron and the ratio of the masses of the proton and the electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. Okay, the last thing we'll consider in this section, and then we'll take our break, is what's called the language of DNA. DNA is the complex and extensive genetic information inside the cells of our body. It determines the way we develop, the way we function. Because DNA contains highly specific information that must be exact, its structure is often compared to language or a code. And a DNA strand is so small, a single hair is about 40,000 times as wide. That's how small the one little DNA strand. And yet, each person contains within them, you and I right now, contain within us about 10 billion miles of DNA inside our body. Think about how much language and coding goes into making your body function the way it does. 10 billion miles of it. That's enough to go to the sun and back 61 times. That is a staggering amount of complex language encoded within the human body. And if there is language, there must be someone who had written it. And so Stephen Meyer, he has a PhD in the philosophy of science from the University of Cambridge. He says this, whether we're looking at a hieroglyphic inscription a section of text in a book, or computer software. If you have information and you trace it back to its source, invariably you come to an intelligence. Therefore, when you find information inscribed along the backbone of the DNA molecule in the cell, the most rational inference based upon our repeated experience is that an intelligence of some kind played a role in the origin of that information. Okay, do we have any questions so far about these two arguments we've considered, the cosmological argument, the teleological argument? None? Okay, let's go ahead and take about a 5-10 minute break, get a drink, get some food, use the restroom, and then we'll convene back here. All right. Well, sadly, due to time constraints, I'm not going to be able to dig as thoroughly into Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways as I would have preferred. I encourage you to go back and read through these. Thomas Aquinas, I mentioned him last week. He was a medieval scholastic. He was a theologian, a philosopher. He provided 5 logical proofs for the existence of God that I think are just absolutely brilliant. In the first way, he argued from change or motion. He said that anytime something changes or is in motion, it's always acted upon by something outside of itself. And so he said, if you trace this back far enough, you have to go back to what's called an unmoved mover. There can't be an infinite regress of things being moved by something else until you get to the end of the line. There has to be an unmoved mover at some point. He made a similar argument in his second way from cause and effect. He said everything in the universe is the product of cause and effect. Nothing causes itself. So if something is caused, there was something that caused it, but then that thing was caused by something else, which was caused by something else. And he said you can't have this go on for infinity. Eventually you have to go back and come to an uncaused cause. He made an argument from necessity. He distinguished between something that is a possible thing and a necessary thing. A possible thing could exist or it could not exist. A necessary thing must exist. It's impossible for it to not exist. And he said if something only possibly exists, there had to have been a time when it did not exist in order for it to be a possibility. So 2 businessmen who are talking about a possible deal means the deal does not exist yet. So if something is possible, that means there was a time it did not exist. But he said there has to be something that was necessary, that was never merely possible, but has always existed. And that necessary being is God. His fourth way was an argument from perfection. He said, we make judgments all the time. You might say that was a good movie. The sheep was not healthy. The king was a just ruler. But that assumes that there really are such things as goodness, health, and justice to which these things might be compared. He said there must be a real standard of goodness by which other goodnesses can be compared. And so he says we depend on the pre-existence of some real goodness by which we can compare all these other things. This absolute goodness, he said, is God. And the fifth way is he argued from purpose or final cause. He said everything is oriented in such a way that it moves towards certain purposes. Even non-living things or even non-personal things. A magnet seems to be going after metal. A seed, which does not have a personality, but it drives towards becoming a plant. He said everything in the world seems to be headed towards some kind of cause. And he said anytime something is pursuing a purpose, it is either acting on its own accord or it's being acted upon by something else. And he used the example of an arrow. He said if an archer is walking towards an archery tournament, he has a purpose he's headed towards, but he is causing his own purpose. He is driving his own purpose. He shoots the arrow. The arrow is headed towards the goal of the bullseye, but that arrow is not moving itself towards its purpose. It can't. It doesn't have an intellect. It was moved by something else, the archer. And so he said, if we look at the world and we see all of these non-personal things moving towards these goals or ends, he said, if they're not moving themselves, they must be being moved by something else with intelligence. And this final cause, he said, is God. So go and read those a little bit more thoroughly. We're going to come to argument number 6, which is called the moral argument. I think this one's very, very powerful. Think with me about the categories of good and evil, right and wrong. These are the 2 opposites that have made up all of our history books, the greatest stories that we tell ourselves, and even our own greatest personal struggles come down to this line between good and evil. But we have to ask, is there really a difference between the 2? Or is good and evil simply a matter of perspective? Can anything really, ultimately, absolutely be called good on one hand and evil on the other? And if so, By what standard do we make that assessment? What are we comparing these things to in which we make these judgment calls? What are we comparing people, thoughts, words, actions, ideologies, and movements to when we call them right or wrong? And so the moral argument claims that the reality of these categories, right and wrong, can only adequately be explained by the existence of a moral standard establishing God. Because here's the thing about morality. Morality is not simply an observation about the way things are. Morality is a judgment about the way things should be. Morality says someone ought to do this or someone ought not to do that. The interesting thing about morality is we don't see this binding sort of system on any other creature. If we are simply animals, we have to be able to explain, why is it we possess this absolute standard of right and wrong and no other creature does? Animals do things all the time that would be utterly inexcusable for any other human to do to another human. So on what basis can we say the humans are the ones committing something egregiously off limits? So I can think of a couple examples looking at the animal world. We had chickens. We used to have 4 of them. And one of them, she was a sickly thing. She was always getting sick. And whenever she would get sick, the other 3 chickens would gang up on her. They didn't want her around because she was the sick one of the bunch. They would peck her skull. They pecked out all her feathers. They were pecking down through flesh to the bone. That there were feathers everywhere. We would find blood everywhere in the coop. Now imagine if humans said, hey, someone in our group is sick. Let's mercilessly attack them and bludgeon them to death because we want to get the sick ones out of our midst. Neighborhood cats. We've got a ton of them in our neighborhood. And we hear them making these horrific sounds straight out of a horror movie. And I wondered what it was, and I looked it up, and I found out that the way that cats reproduce is because the males always rape the females. They pin them down, and they force themselves on them. But that's how the cat species survives. Now imagine if someone tried to make the serious claim, that's how human survival should continue, is men should just grab whatever woman they want and go for it. We would be appalled by such a thing. I've seen actually a couple different videos of, there's these high nests way high up. The mother bird has a couple of eggs that have hatched, these cute little chicks. Well, then there's one little kind of runt chick. And this one little runt chick, the mom is not going to waste valuable food and care on this little sick runt. So she grabs it by its neck and chucks it out of the nest down out of this big tree. No concern for it whatsoever. I remember seeing one video. I have a weakness for these nature videos. There was another one I saw where there's this pack of lions, this pride of lions, and they were trying to take down, it was like a rhino or a buffalo or something really big. One of the lions got maimed in his back legs, and he was just dragging himself by his front paws. And the other lions did not gather around him and give him around-the-clock care or buy him flowers or anything like that. They left him behind. Oh, well, too slow. You know, imagine if we did that to our sick ones. There was one other one I'll share about lions. These lions took down a warthog. And if you've ever seen like The Lion King and you're attached to it, that's a little bit of a reality wake up when you see lions eating a warthog. This warthog is making these horrible squeals and shrieks because the lions were disemboweling him and eating him while he's alive. Like I'm not trying to be crude here, but I kind of am. I mean, there were warthog guts everywhere and the lions are chowing down and the thing is still alive, squealing in agony. And you know what happens is if you read the comments on these videos, people will say, sad, but that's nature. We would never say that when we do that to each other. If you call someone a jerk, you're considered a really rude kind of immoral person because humans are held to these real moral standards. Why is that? So I think it's pretty safe to conclude there are no such thing as moral relativists. We talked about that last week. Now, there are people who claim to be moral relativists. I don't think they actually exist. Moral relativism claims that all morality is subjective. Good and evil are simply the different perspectives of different people at different times. Now, it's true on one hand, certain groups have had different standards on certain areas of morality. But that's not really a moral claim. That's just a historical fact. People have had different standards. The relativist goes a step further and doesn't just say different groups have had different standards on certain things. The relativist goes a step further and says, well, there's no such thing as good or evil at all. And I think the relativist can be very easily disproved using 2 different methods. One is what I would call the historical test, and the other would be the personal test. The historical test would be find an issue that is really important to the relativist and point to an area in history where that standard was being violated. Point to it and say, are you willing to say that this thing done by this previous culture was not actually wrong? So point back to, say, for example, cannibalism, rape, human sacrifice, slavery. Would you point back to those things and say, no wrong was actually committed? That was just that culture's personal perspective. Most people, thankfully, would say no, but it exposes their inconsistency. Because if you can say there is even one, just one moral standard that you think must always be applied across the board, you are not a moral relativist. All it takes is one standard, one moral issue that must always be binding, and your relativism has been exposed as a fraud. But then there's the personal test. In Mere Christianity, C.S. Lewis pointed out that no moral relativist is consistent about their claims, because he said, whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in real right or wrong, you'll find the same man going back on this a moment later. So suppose a relativist claims, yeah, all morality is subjective, and then you punch him in the face or you steal his wallet. Is he going to say, well, that's just you living out your personal standard of right or wrong? No, he's going to believe that some real moral travesty has been committed against him because he knows there's such a thing as right or wrong. Now, I would argue that our culture today is incredibly inconsistent on this level. We want the freedom of claiming relativism, but we don't actually buy it. So, for example, whenever my kids watch an old Disney movie on Disney Plus, some of the old movies have this warning that comes on the front now. Like if you watch Peter Pan or something like that, it includes this disclaimer. It says, this program includes negative depictions and/or mistreatment of people or cultures. These stereotypes were wrong then and are wrong now. So, for example, you have like in Peter Pan, right, the way that maybe the Native Americans are portrayed, or in Dumbo, you have some African-American railroad workers. And so these movies will apologize and say, hey, this depiction may have been done, 80 years ago, but it was wrong then, and it's wrong now. That's an important statement. It was wrong then. You are applying an objective moral standard. Disney does not simply say, at the time, this was morally okay, but now we've changed our moral standard. They're saying they shouldn't have done that then, and we don't think it should be done now. So you are actually showing you are not a relativist. You believe that it's binding. Another example would be, I'm going to maybe betray my age here, but there was a rock band I used to really, really love called 30 Seconds to Mars. And I still listen to them. So I'm going to read you two different sets of lyrics from the same album. Okay, listen to this, from the same album. The first one from this song says, I believe in nothing but the beating of our hearts. I believe in nothing, not in sin and not in God. I believe in nothing, not in peace and not in war. I believe in nothing but the truth in who we are. Oh, isn't that just so nice? Right? This is basically saying I don't ascribe to any standard of sin or God or ultimate meaning. It's just kind of my heartbeat right this moment. But then on the same album, they do a song that says this, a warning to the people, the good and the evil. This is war. To the right, to the left, we'll fight to the death. I do believe in the light. Raise your hands into the sky. The fight is done. The war is won. What the heck kind of war are you fighting if there's no such thing as good or evil? What do you mean you believe in the light? How do you even define good or evil if you believe in nothing but your own momentary heartbeat and there's no such thing as sin, if there's no objective moral standard? So the relativist cannot consistently live out their worldview. And I think our culture is very confused about that right now. Okay, so all this to say, someone might say, okay, fine. There really is such a thing as moral good and evil. But then the big question is, why do we need God for this? Just because I believe in good and evil doesn't mean God is necessary. Now I want to show that any attempt to explain morality outside of a divine lawgiver before whom we're all accountable actually cannot account for the binding nature of morality. In the end, these all are just a type of subjectivism. They all just become a matter of personal preference and opinion. So I think anyone who believes in moral absolutes, which I would argue is actually everybody, but does not believe in God, is living in a major contradiction with themselves. So let's look at a couple different theories about where morality comes from. Some people have suggested different, okay, we believe there's absolute right or wrong. Where does this morality come from? We don't think we need God, so where does it come from? First thing I want to note is that science can't account for morality. Imagine if there was a murder scene and there was a corpse laying on the ground. A forensic scientist can tell you a lot of helpful information about that murder. They could examine it, and they could provide an incredibly accurate account of what happened to the body, what caused the death, how the organs functioned and failed, and blood, and they could trace it back and solve the crime using a lot of scientific data. Great. But you know what that scientific method can't do? It can't make an ethical judgment about whether it was right or wrong for that person to be killed. Science can tell you about natural things. It cannot make ethical judgments. So where do these ethical judgments come from? Here's a few suggestions. I'm going to throw out 5. First, from me. Every person decides their own standard of right or wrong. You decide for yourself what is good and evil. Now, this is an unlivable proposition because criminals and serial killers could never be held accountable for their actions because in their mind, maybe they weren't doing something so bad after all. According to their own standard of morality, they were justified. So we don't want to live in a world where I am my own source of morality. The other option is society. Every culture collectively decides what's right or wrong for that culture. But we mentioned this earlier. That would mean you could never critique another culture for anything. Thinking there's a Hindu practice where if a woman's husband dies, his body is burned and she is burned alive with him, even though she's not dead yet. Aztecs would rip still beating hearts out of their sacrificial victims. Southern plantation owners buying slaves and treating them like cattle. Nazis exterminating what they deemed to be lesser races of people from the land. All of these things, guys, were done with the collective consensus of the society. The majority of people living in the land at that time had no problem with these practices. So we could not say those things were actually wrong. Another person might say, well, it comes from laws. Right and wrong are simply determined by the laws of the land. But we have a big problem with that as well, because that would mean someone like Harriet Tubman was immoral. Harriet Tubman, who was herself a slave in the South, who escaped and then went back and helped lead hundreds of other slaves up to freedom. She was breaking the law of the land. So we would look at her and we would say, no, she was actually an evil person. She defied the laws of the land. Or everybody who sheltered Jews during the Nazi Holocaust. They were evil because they were breaking the law of the land. So I don't think anybody actually buys that one either. Fourthly, well, whatever doesn't hurt people. Right? So people are free to determine morality for themselves so long as, with this one stipulation, you don't hurt other people. Now that sounds better, but it's still got 2 very big problems. First of all, it cannot be a tenable source of morality because it already contains within itself a moral assumption. It includes the assumption that hurting people is immoral. But remember, we're trying to determine a source of morality. If you say you can do whatever you want except for hurting people, you are sneaking a moral judgment in there. Who says hurting other people is wrong? You've now snuck your moral assumption into your proposal. So you can't go that route. There's another problem with this, though. It can't be consistently applied. All right, you can do whatever you want as long as nobody gets hurt. Okay, let's apply that to a situation. Let's say a man cheated on his wife, but he could, hypothetical scenario, he was able to guarantee 110% she would never find out. And since she would never find out, she would never be hurt by it. So this guy does what he wants. Nobody gets hurt. Does that mean his action is now okay? Did he still do something wrong? Because if it is, if you're going to say nobody got hurt, but the action itself was still wrong, you are now admitting that an action is right or wrong, not necessarily in reference to its consequences, but in the action itself. So the big question is then, what standard is being violated when he does this wrong thing? What intrinsically makes an action right or wrong? And then the last attempt to explain the source of morality is, well, whatever does the maximum amount of good for the maximum amount of people. Right and wrong are determined by what brings the most benefit to the most number of people. This suffers from the same problems as some of the previous options. So again, when you say it's whatever is maximally good for the amount of people, you're sneaking in another judgment, because what is good? As soon as you attempt to define what good is, you are making a value judgment. You have not avoided the problem at all. You're right back where you started. Good cannot be examined under a microscope. As soon as you define good, you're making moral judgments again. It relies on a circular argument. And then, excuse me, who gets to define what's good for people? Who gets to say what the greatest good is? Or what do you mean by the most amount of people? Do you mean 51% of the population or 99% of the population? And then this would make it morally good to inflict harm on a small group of people if it could bring benefit to the rest of the group. I don't think anybody consistently wants to live this out either. So none of these suggestions can actually provide us with an objective source for morality. Something else is needed. So none of us are moral relativists. We all know there's such a thing as right and wrong. We expect other people to adhere to those standards when they're interacting with us. But within a materialistic evolutionary system, we cannot point to an objective or binding standard. All attempts to do so just lead us into inconsistencies. I think the best explanation for the reality of moral laws is a cosmic law giver. If such a being were to exist, that would explain where morality comes from. It would explain why humans are uniquely moral, and it would explain why it would explain why morality is truly binding. Okay, I mentioned there as well an argument from conscience. This was put forward by a philosopher and apologist named Peter Kreeft, who's a wonderful apologist, by the way. He appeals to the existence of conscience. He says everybody will acknowledge there's a conscience. There's this voice in your head that nags you when you do something you shouldn't have done, or when you don't do something you ought to have done. You experience guilt. Conscience is real and it's heavy. But he asks, where's the authority of conscience come from? He says there's four possibilities. Could have come from nature, from yourself, from others, or from God. If it comes from nature, that doesn't make sense because, like we've already said, the natural world gives no indication of morality. It would just reduce your conscience to animalistic instincts, but that would remove its binding power. We ignore our animalistic instincts all the time, very often in the name of conscience. If you've got an instinct that you really want to follow, your conscience will tell you don't follow that instinct because it's morally wrong. So a conscience is clearly not the same as an animalistic instinct. It's often going against your instincts. So it can't be found in nature. If it comes from yourself, then you're not obligated to obey it. Because Kreeft says, if I'm the one who locked myself in this prison of obligation, I can let myself out. You've enslaved yourself. You can let yourself out anytime you want to. If it comes from others, he said, then that would reduce morality to popular opinion. And that would go against the fact that most of the time when you feel a conviction of conscience, it's very often in a situation where everybody else is doing something that you feel like you shouldn't do. So conscience can't just come from others. The fourth option is that it comes from God or from some authority beyond the natural world, beyond ourselves and beyond the opinions of others. This is actually the same argument Paul made in Romans chapter 2. He said, for when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do what the law requires, they are a law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them on the day when, according to my gospel, God judges the secrets of men by Christ Jesus. Paul is saying here, not everybody has access to the written law of God and Scripture, but he said they show that the basic tenets of God's law, of God's moral system, are written on their hearts because they have this thing called a conscience. And when they do something wrong and their conscience is pricked and they feel guilt, they show that they have this sense of a standard of right or wrong before whom I am accountable. And that knowledge ought to direct our gaze to the authority above us before whom we must all give an account. All right, we'll go through these last two sections pretty quick. The last argument here, excuse me, argues from love, beauty, and purpose. Now, these are not direct proofs for God, but they take concepts that I think we already know are true and powerful, and they demonstrate that an atheistic, materialistic system can't actually make real sense of them. So the first one is love. Love is a universal phenomena. It's powerful. Everybody's experienced it. How many fairy tales or stories do we tell where love almost takes on this super-powered sort of quality, right? But from a naturalistic perspective, all love is nature's way of getting us to reproduce and to ensure the thriving of our species. Love is little more than neurons designed to keep the human race alive. I don't think this is an adequate explanation because there are many instances of love that actually seem antithetical to the overall benefit of our species. I used an example last week of, let's say you have a family that has 10 children, and one of those children has extreme special needs, and that special needs child requires a ton of around-the-clock care. They need extra attention. They need extra support. The family is now spending an exorbitant amount of money, energy, and resources on this one sick child who will never grow up and never be independent and will never honestly contribute to the thriving of the human species. And yet all their other children are now maybe suffering neglect in order to care for this sick one. We would look at that and we would say, wow, that family really loves that child. From a Darwinian perspective, you're hurting the whole rest of the family. The mother bird chucks the little sick one out of the nest in the natural world. But we know that love cannot simply be reduced by what allows the species to thrive the most. Sometimes the greatest acts of love are the ones that actually seem to harm people overall. But because we know love in itself defies simply survival. An atheist who elects to eliminate their sick child or leave behind the crippled one in the group, they would actually be acting in perfect accord with their own Darwinian worldview. Thankfully, most atheists are terribly inconsistent on this point. Many of them do exhibit self-sacrificial love. They prioritize helping the least of these, but their own worldview can't provide a binding reason for why it is good to do so. We can also look at beauty. As human beings, we have a natural penchant for beauty. We recognize it not simply in other humans, but in nature, architecture, art, and music. Why is that? The Darwinian perspective is that beauty is little more than an attraction towards that which provides a survival advantage. So the reason why men find certain physical characteristics in women attractive is because, oh, that's going to be good for birthing babies. And the reason why women find certain traits attractive in men is, oh, he's going to keep me safe from predators and enemies. That's why women like the men with the big shoulders and the strong arms. Or perhaps you find certain landscapes attractive because, oh, that's really conducive for my survival. There's plenty of resources here, plenty of shelter. I think that looks like a really safe, good place to live. Therefore, I find it beautiful. But these simplistic answers won't do. There's many dangerous, unlivable climates that we might find aesthetically pleasing, and their beauty is not tied to their practicality. You might look at an icy tundra. I would hate to live there, but there's no denying the aesthetic beauty of it. Every living creature has a habitat of some kind, but have you ever thought about this? Every animal habitat serves strictly utilitarian purposes. Humans are the only creatures who intentionally build things just because they are beautiful. In fact, we are drawn to things. Sometimes they might be incredibly impractical on a living perspective, but we're drawn to them because of the beauty itself. There's a beauty in art and music that provides enjoyment, but here's the thing about that beauty. It provides no distinct advantage to our survival. Ever thought about that? Beauty, certain types of beauty, like in music or in buildings, it does nothing to contribute to the survival of our species. Animals get along just fine without it. We do not look at things from a strictly practical perspective. We look at it from a beauty perspective. The question is, why? I think beauty hints at something more and something deeper. If you look at beautiful artwork, you hear beautiful music, you step foot inside a grand piece of architecture, it makes you feel something more than just physical survival. The only question is what? What could the deeper be? If we only live in a materialistic universe, beauty is an illusion and, frankly, a big waste of your time. C.S. Lewis puts this beautifully. He said, "The books or the music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them. It only came through them. And what came through them was longing." These things, the beauty, the memory of our own past, they're good images of what we really desire. But if they are mistaken for the thing itself, they turn into dumb idols, breaking the hearts of their worshipers. For they are not the thing itself. They are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a far country we have never yet visited. I agree with Lewis. I think this reality of beauty points to something beyond the material world. And then the last thing there is meaning and purpose. The Time Machine by H.G. Wells was written in 1895. It was one of the first books that really dealt with this issue of time travel. Nowadays, that's like all the rage in sci-fi. Everything is reduced to time travel. But in his day, H.G. Wells was kind of an innovator, because in the Time Machine, it's this man who builds this time machine and he goes forward into the future. And at the very end of the book, I'm going to spoil it here. At the very end of the book, he goes forward to the very end of the world. And H.G. Wells was not a Christian. He did not believe in God. And what I like about H.G. Wells is he's what I would call an honest atheist. He admits where his worldview will lead. Because listen to what happens at the end of the book as this man goes to the end of planet Earth's life. And he comes to this abandoned place where all major forms of all major life forms have ceased. Buildings have long since eroded. The sun is dying out and planet Earth is on its last gasp. And he says, "From the edge of the sea came a ripple and whisper. Beyond these lifeless sounds, the world was silent." Silent? It would be hard to convey the stillness of it. All the sounds of man, the bleating of sheep, the cries of birds, the hum of insects, the stir that makes the background of our lives, all that was over. A horror of this great darkness came on me. The cold that smote to my marrow and the pain I felt in breathing overcame me. I shivered and a deadly nausea seized me. This is what the end of history looks like if there is no God. Simply a descent into nothingness. And all the cities we've built, and all the progress we've made, and all the computers we've constructed, and all the rocket ships we built, they all amount to nothingness in the end. We talked last week about how there's the view that we can create our own meaning and purpose. But if there is no God, then nothing we do ultimately has any significance. Because think about this. Any advances you make, anything impressive that we do, whether as individuals or as a species, someday it will all be inevitably swallowed up by the nothingness that awaits. Because it is not simply the earth that will someday spiral into ruin, the universe itself will wind down into oblivion. And if this giant universe turns out to be meaningless, so will all of the silly little things done within it. When the universe returns back to the mindless nothingness from which it came, the ultimate state of things will not have been affected one little iota by the universe's existence or any of the events that happened within it. Certainly not from a little tiny speck of dust like us. And when this happens, when the universe collapses back in on itself and it all goes away, there will be no lasting impact from our presence. The people that you loved, the memories you made, the beautiful music you listened to, the achievements you won, the awards on your wall, it won't matter one little bit. In fact, our presence won't even leave a scar in the fabric of reality. It'll be like we were never here at all. Now, this doesn't necessarily prove that God exists. That could very well be the sad fact of the matter. But I think this is an unlivable proposition, and I think it goes against everything we know. And yet, that is the necessary consequence of atheism. And yet, so many atheists refuse to accept it. Atheists want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to cut shackles from God and declare that we have absolute freedom. We can define our own meaning and our own purpose. This is meant to elevate man. Yet the moment you cut yourself free from God, you leave yourself as little more than an accidental blip of sand in an unfathomable universe. Your existence lasts but a blink in the uncountable eons of the universe. The universe will never know or care that you existed. And the people you hope remember you, the universe isn't going to really care that they existed either. In trying to elevate man, you've reduced him to less than a speck of dust. At the precise moment you think you've cut yourself free of God, you have damned yourself to nothingness. Life is unlivable without the existence of God. And this brings us to our final point here, and that is Pascal's wager. Pascal was a French mathematician and philosopher. He was also a very devout Christian who used reason and logic to rebuke these rising secular claims of the Enlightenment. Pascal pointed out that life is full of risks. He said every day we make choices, and the future outcome of those choices are not always known. But why we have to take risks based on which will produce the best yield in contrast to the choice that will produce the worst consequences. So every decision you make is a risk of some kind. And you have to make the choice that will produce the best yield versus what will produce the worst consequences. And Pascal, he made plenty of great arguments for God's existence, but he's most known for this wager that he made. So let's suppose someone's up in the air on the question of God's existence. You've heard all the evidence and you're just back and forth. Maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. How do you choose between the two? Pascal considered this from the angle of risk. He said, which is better, to believe in God and die to find out he does not exist, or to not believe in God and then find out that he does exist? There's risk, faith, we might say, either way. But which option produces the greater amount of good at a lower loss incurred? And which option produces the lesser good at a higher loss incurred? So here is Pascal's reasoning. He said, if we believe in God and he turns out not to be real, then sure, we'll have lost a couple pleasures along the way. There's things you may have wanted to engage in that you didn't because you believed that God was watching you and you had to answer him. Sure, you're going to lose out on some things. There's certain pleasures you're going to pass up on. But in the long run, you will have lived this life with more hope, with more purpose, with a stronger drive to live more upright. And when you die, guess what? You'll never actually find out if God doesn't exist or not because you'll be dead and you won't know anything. So you'll live your life with hope, meaning, purpose, and a drive to be better, and then you'll die and you'll never know if God didn't exist or not. So he said, that's the risk. So are you willing to give up a few pleasures in order to achieve the possibility that God might exist? It might all be worth it. He said, you actually don't have much to lose there. You actually don't have much to lose if you decide to live as though God existed. You have a peaceful lifetime and no risk of misery after death. He said, if you believe in God and God turns out not to be real, you risk nothing after death, and you won't even know the difference. But if we do not believe in God and he turns out to be real, then sure, you'll have enjoyed a few pleasures along the way, a pleasure that maybe a believer denied themselves. Oh, but at a much greater cost. For the unbeliever will never be able to have confidence in the value of their own life. They will never have a binding obligation to treat others in an upright way. And when they die, they will find out in the greatest and most horrific way imaginable just how wrong they were. He says, this then is the wager everyone must place. He said, you can't help but wager. You have to cast your wager one way or the other. Everyone takes this risk. Pascal, like a good mathematician, weighed the two options, and he thought the better choice was quite evident. Now, I think that when we examine the evidence for God, I think we have every reason to be confident that God exists. And in fact, as we continue on through this class, I think we have very good reason to believe not just that some random God exists, but specifically the God of Christianity, who sent his son Jesus to die for our sins to save us. But as we examine this night, hopefully it gives us a good deal of confidence. Confidence in our own faith in God, confidence in being able to share him with others so that you don't just sound like a superstitious child believing in fairy tales, but there is very good evidence to believe that God exists. And guys, I think that he is worth the risk of faith. Let's go ahead and pray, and then we'll conclude our evening. Lord, I thank you for tonight. I thank you for the testimony of yourself that you have written into the fabric of the universe. I pray that as we have considered these things tonight, I ask that you would move not just our minds, but our hearts as well. I ask that as we consider the reality of who you are, it would stir us up to a greater love for you, a greater trust in you, and a greater amazement that the same God who has brought the cosmos into existence, who is the uncaused cause behind everything, the same God who has written these incredibly complex constants in our universe, who has designed and upholds these meticulous details of reality. That same God who is absolutely holy, from whom all perfect morality comes. The same God who is all love and who is all beauty and who has designed us with purpose. Oh, that God would look upon us and that you would love us and that you would desire us and that you would send your Son to die instead of us that we might be with you. What a mind-blowing thought. And I ask that as it rattles our minds, Lord, that it would also stir our hearts unto adoration. I praise you for your love, for your goodness, and for the testimony of yourself that you have left. Would you impress this upon all of our hearts? Would you wipe away our doubts and our fears and replace it with a boldness and a confidence in you and in your Son, Jesus, in whose mighty name we pray. Amen.